Today, in 2022, the internet is everywhere. Whether it is to communicate with loved ones, play games, work, date, or invest in cryptocurrency, everyone uses it in one way or another. Or at least, that's what you might think if you live near a big city in Europe, North America, or East Asia and you are less than 70 years old. The truth is that 40% of the world's population did not use the internet frequently in 2021. What this also means, however, is that 60% of humanity often uses the internet. And that's a pretty big percentage when you consider that just over 30 years ago the internet did not exist, and that 60 years ago the very concept of a large-scale computer network was just a science fiction writer's fantasy that was about as plausible as a flying car. You may be wondering why I'm telling you all of this when we're supposed to be talking about cryptocurrency. Well, it's because the similarities between the internet and cryptocurrency are remarkable. But in order to be able to see these similarities, you need to know internet's whole history and genesis. So I'm going to take you on a journey back to the 20th century before moving on to the main topic of this video. For everyone to really understand how the modern internet came about, we are going to have to go back to the 60s, to the very beginning of computer networks. After World War II and the birth of computers, we eventually got to the level where computers were complex enough to communicate with each other. During the 60s, computer scientists all around the world began to devise methods for two computers to exchange data. Around 1965, the American network ARPANET, which you may be familiar with, appeared at about the same time as the British network called NPL, which you probably don't know. And then there was also the Cyclades network, a French research network led by Louis Pouzin, whose research and choices strongly influenced the design of ARPANET. Finally, there were the networks based on the X25 protocol, created thanks to the contributions of many scientists from various countries. Whatever you may have heard elsewhere, it is important to know that it was not the Americans who invented the internet on their own. The work on these ancestors of the internet was done all over the place, in Europe, Russia, or even Japan. All these networks worked differently, and they were not compatible with each other. You couldn't exchange data between ARPANET and NPL, for example. This is something that changed with the appearance of the TCP/IP protocol. This protocol was not designed by Americans alone either, but by the International Networking Working Group. In other words, a group created in 1972 by an American, but in which there were people from other countries, from the United Kingdom and from France. Louis Pouzin and Hubert Zimmermann, for example, were part of that group, and they're French. With all these world-renowned researchers, both TCP and IP took a few years of work to design and implement. It was only in the late 70s that the TCP/IP package was more or less perfected. From 1980 onwards, TCP/IP spread around the world, country by country. Various networks that had previously been confined to a single nation found themselves connected to others. These were mainly academic or scientific networks, such as the ones from CERN in Switzerland, INRIA in France, or the University of London. Overall, by 1990, the internet was born. A large number of countries were interconnected, and the number of service providers offering their services to the general public increased dramatically. The internet went from being primarily a scientific and academic network to being open to everyone. A whole lot of other innovations made this possible, of course, like browsers, web addresses around 1989 and so on. But the fact is that to get to something vaguely usable by the general public, it took more than 25 years of research and progress between 1965 and 1990. And again, I'm being generous, because in 1990, it was very rare for most people to have access to the internet, and it took another 10 to 20 years for this famous network to become something 100% integrated into modern society. And then, as I explained a few minutes earlier, even today in 2021, there is 40% of the world's population that does not frequently use the internet. In other words, there are still people who don't have an easy access to it, even though the idea of a computer network has been around for over 50 years. And this brings us to today's topic. The connection between blockchains is not so different from the internet. Bitcoin was a revolutionary idea, but it is comparable to the very first computer. It does not have all the functions that the public is looking for. it is not necessarily accessible to everyone because it's difficult to use, etc. As for Ethereum, you should know that it has often been called a world computer. This comparison with the computers we know, I certainly did not invent it. And the same can be said of all other modern cryptocurrencies for that matter. They are comparable to computers from the 1960s, not only because they are not yet fully adapted for use by the general public, but also because they still have great difficulty communicating with each other. And just as with computers, the ability of blockchains to exchange information will increase their usefulness tenfold. A blockchain that is connected to a system which can send information elsewhere is a blockchain that can be accessed by anyone who uses the other blockchains that use this communication system. To illustrate this, let's imagine that there is a blockchain that has 10,000 users, and it's plugged into a communication network that allows communication with two other blockchains that have a total of 200,000 users. When the small blockchain is connected to the network, its users will be able to communicate with 210,000 people instead of just 10,000. The exchange of value is facilitated between the networks, and it becomes possible for users of the small blockchain to trade with a much larger number of people. Today, there are several inter-blockchain communication systems. First of all, there are obviously the centralized systems. It is the exchange platforms most of the time. It is possible, after all, to send Ether on Binance, sell it for Matic, and withdraw it on the Polygon network. But that requires creating an account, maybe giving your ID and waiting a few days, and then declaring the creation of that account to the administration a few months later. Slow, annoying, and potentially dangerous if it's a dubious website. Then there are the famous bridges, which are more or less decentralized systems for transferring assets from one chain to another. The systems used vary. Some are more centralized than others, but in any case, the principle is broadly the same. There are two smart contracts created, one on each network, and when you send tokens to the contract on one network, a message is sent to the contract on the other network, which transfers a specific token to your address on the second network. It's often a wrapped token, so it's not even really the asset that you send, it's just an IOU token. So it has the same value in principle, but that's it. For financial investments, this is interesting, but there are disadvantages. For example, because there may be several bridges with different versions of the wrapped tokens. This is what happens on Avalanche when the transition between the old bridge and the new bridge took place. Tokens changed name and address between the first and second bridge, and their holders had to convert them in order to keep using them on all their favorite DeFi applications. And then the biggest problem with bridges is that they are not always compatible with all assets, and that they are never compatible with all chains. Those who manage a bridge have to manually deploy additional systems on the chains they want to connect to their bridges, and they potentially have to recreate wrapped token contracts to allow their customers to send specific tokens through their bridge. In other words, bridges are labor-intensive, they cannot be used in all situations, and they are often slow and expensive due to transaction fees in some networks. Finally, the last type of systems that are currently rising up are the interoperability ecosystems. In the last few years, we have seen the slow birth of cryptocurrencies like Polkadot, Cosmos, or Avalanche. These have been designed from the start to allow multiple blockchains to interact, so this is already a major advance. On Polkadot, 100 parachains will be directly connected to the main chain and will be able to interact with each other through this link. On Avalanche, there are subnets that are connected to the primary network and have their blocks validated by validators who also work on the primary network. There is no quantity limit like the 100 parachains of Polkadot, but whether it is on Avalanche, Cosmos or Polkadot, there are still limits. In this case, the main limitation is that the blockchains that are part of these networks must be designed from the ground up to meet the requirements of the chosen network and adopt certain code or consensus elements. In other words, Avalanche subnets can communicate with each other, but they cannot communicate with Polkadot parachains or chains that are part of the Cosmos ecosystem. Doesn't that remind you of something now? Because when I say all that, I really feel like I'm talking about computers before 1990. the sequence of steps in the evolution of these communication systems is incredibly similar. Centralized systems for moving from one crypto network to another are a bit like exchanging data through a human being moving punch cards or magnetic tapes from one computer to another. Slow and impractical. Then there were the bridges, comparable with a network cable that connects two sufficiently close computers in a rather direct way. And finally, we got the first interoperable blockchain networks, just as we got the first networks like ARPANET and Cyclades. So this is where we are in practice. The year 2021 for blockchain is roughly equivalent in terms of development to the year 1980 for the internet. But as it was the case for the internet, it is now time for cryptocurrencies to connect with each other on a large scale, and in ways that don't have as many drawbacks as those available today. So I'm going to introduce you to Axelar, a crypto network that hopes to become for cryptocurrencies what the internet has become for computers. First of all, Axelar is the project of a rather solid team. It includes Sergey Garbunov and Yaroslav Vlachos, both founding members of Algorand and MIT graduates. And they are far from being the only members of the team to have such qualifications. By the way, Sami, my colleague, recently spoke with Sergey Garbunov during the Solana Breakpoint event, so if you want to see their interview after finishing my video, you'll find it on the Journal du Coin's YouTube channel. Most of the videos are in French, but this one at least is in English. Besides the team, there are also quite a lot of investors, including Coinbase Ventures, Binance, Polychain Capital, etc. So one thing's for sure, there's no shortage of funding. And the Axelar team, full of talent as you could see on the presentation page, has decided to set up a system for exchanging data and assets between blockchains that will be a revolution compared to what we have today. Their system will be designed around 4 specific objectives to be achieved. Firstly, it will be a system that can be described as plug and play. That is, it does not require any modification to be integrated into a blockchain. All that is needed is a functioning crypto network. And for it to be connected to Axelar, there must be no need for any modification on that network. No changes to the consensus protocol, no need to use a specific programming language, etc. The Axelar protocol should be made compatible with new blockchains very easily. That's the first objective. Secondly, Axelar must have a cross-chain routing system. A network must facilitate the discovery of addresses and applications across networks, and therefore it must facilitate the sending of data from one place to another. Thirdly, the network will have to be easily upgradable. This is sort of the opposite of the planned obsolescence that we suffer from with modern electronic devices like smartphones. Here, it will have to be a network that is built to last. And it will also have to be a network that does not collapse at the slightest change in any of the blockchains connected to it. If a blockchain changes, for example if Ethereum moves from proof of work to proof of stake, the Axelar network must be able to adapt to this change quickly and with the least possible effort. Lastly, it will be necessary for applications passing through Axelar to be able to use a single language for all the actions they might need to perform, such as transferring a message, locking or unlocking assets, transferring them from one chain to another. The network will have to allow any chain to communicate information to any other chain through this language. And after that, there are also a number of security requirements. The first is that the network and protocols must be decentralized, open, and allow everyone to participate fairly. It's something that we expected anyway, but it's worth mentioning it explicitly given how some bridge systems work. The Silo Optics bridge and the Chainbridge bridge, for example, currently rely on so-called trusted participants. It's not like an exchange platform where one company controls everything, but it's still something that is far from perfect decentralization. Secondly, the network must offer a guarantee of safety. That is to say, the system must preserve the assets as well as the state of the network while a transfer is being processed. The data and assets must not be altered or lost. This sounds obvious, but it should be noted that some bridges do not necessarily guarantee this. For example, in the case of the Near Rainbow Bridge, there is a limit. After 7 days, if the transfer is not validated, the assets could be lost. This is almost a purely theoretical limit, and an event that may never happen on this bridge, but it is possible nonetheless. and for the Axelar developers, probably not is not enough. It has to be impossible. Finally, the network must offer a guarantee of liveliness. The network must be active, united, and reach consensus quickly without there being network nodes that are isolated from the rest and unable to communicate. On a network where this kind of thing happens, it is difficult for users to be sure that their transactions will be published. If they send a message to a node that is cut off from the network, it can take time. So in the case of Axelar, it is important to avoid these situations in order to allow a fast and secure exchange between blockchains. Individually, all these criteria are relatively easy to meet. But designing a system that manages to do it all at the same time is much more difficult. And in the case of Axelar, it seems to have been achieved. In order to understand how they do it, let's take a look at the network. First of all, it is important to know that the objectives I mentioned above are basically achieved thanks to two systems: Cross-Chain Gateway Protocol and the Cross-Chain Transfer Protocol. We will talk about those systems a little bit later. Secondly, you need to know that Axelar is a network based on the Cosmos SDK and Tendermint consensus. Nothing very surprising given the popularity of the Cosmos SDK and the advantage of the existence of the IBC protocol. It is a rather fast network with good security guarantees and based on delegated proof of stake. It's a good choice in principle, but I think it's a shame that Axelar arrived too early to benefit from the technological advances that were made with the Avalanche consensus. At the time the idea of Axelar was born, Avalanche did not yet have a mainnet and did not prove itself, while the Cosmos network had existed for a long time, which explains the choice made by the team. For those of you who wonder why I am saying this, it's because the Cosmos network and the other Tendermint-based networks have far fewer validators than Avalanche. Cosmos itself has only 150 participants at the moment. Anyone who does not have enough voting power to be in the top 150 is not allowed to validate blocks at all. Whereas in Avalanche, there are almost 8 times as many validators. In other words, I consider Avalanche to be much more decentralized, and the network is neither slower nor more expensive than Cosmos. So it would have been great if Axelar was built on the Avalanche consensus. However, please do take note that I'm absolutely not saying it should have been an AVAX subnet. Avalanche consensus can be used by anyone who wants to. Anyway, to sum it up, the network has a very good foundation. It's secure and fast. Maybe not perfect, but it's good nonetheless. And we must remember that the internet was not perfect in 1990 either. It took another 10 years of evolution to see it reach our homes, and 20 years after that for the most remote corners of the world to benefit from it too. So let's be patient. The difference between Axelar and the default Cosmos type network is that Axelar nodes are not just Axelar nodes. They are also nodes participating in the life of all blockchains compatible with the Axelar network. Indeed, checking the state of other blockchains is a part of the Axelar consensus. The validators each must run lightweight nodes which consume relatively few resources to be able to individually check what is happening on the connected blockchains. The validator transfers this information to the Axelar network, and once all validators agree on the status of each blockchain, it is recorded on the Axelar chain. Thanks to this system, the Axelar network is always aware of what is happening on all the other chains. In other words, it is the entrance for information on the Axelar network. The data and assets coming into Axelar are visible at all times. But how do they manage this information and these assets? It's actually very simple. Validators use a shared account, so to speak. A bit like a DAO, the validators use a key and an address which are used to represent the Axelar network on another chain, and they can only use that address if a certain percentage of them agree. This amount is not necessarily 50%, it can be 80 or 30 for example. This is a system called threshold signatures. With this system, they can move assets or send information to other chains as long as enough of them agree to do so. This is the mechanism that constitutes the exit of the network. The address that is known to the users, which is the entry point to Axelar, is constantly monitored by the validators, and the validators can issue transactions on another chain when they agree to allow assets and information to leave the network. As the white paper says, it can be considered as a kind of decentralized cross-chain oracle capable of reading and writing data. So let's go back a bit now. I had mentioned a little earlier a system called the Cross-Chain Portal Protocol. Well, that's what the Cross-Chain Portal is. It's this system that I just described, which is based on computers monitoring the blockchains and cooperating to decide which transactions to send out. And now we'll talk about the second major element created for Axelar, which is the Cross-Chain Transfer Protocol. This is a protocol for decentralized applications on the connected chains. In a similar way to HTTP or FTP protocols that allow connection to web servers, the Cross-Chain Transfer Protocol is a set of code elements that allow applications to use a generic API to perform different actions. It is possible with this system to lock or unlock any assets present on any address on any connected blockchain, to automatically trigger remote applications if, for example, an event on chain A should immediately trigger an action on chain B, and it is also possible to interact in a more traditional way with simple information transfers between networks. With these two cross-chain transfer and portal systems, Axelar allows us to monitor what is happening on one side and transfer information and assets on the other, using a simple and universal communication protocol. Quite simply, a revolution in a world where bridges reign supreme. Unfortunately for the impatient, Axelar is still being tested. Version 1.0 of the network is not yet here, and no time frame has been given. But when we get there, Axelar should be compatible with many crypto networks including Ethereum, Avalanche, Phantom, Moonbeam and Polygon, since those are already available on the testnet. Now you may be thinking that it would be a good idea to invest in Axelar right now, but you'll have to wait as well. In fact, there is no Axelar token yet and there's not even a planned public sale at the moment, so watch out for scams and keep an eye on the official channels. All we know right now is that the maximum quantity of Axelar tokens will be set at 1 billion. So in the meantime, if you want to talk about Axelar, to be informed about the token sale and to find all the important news related to the network, I advise you to go and have a look at the official Telegram channel, which you can find on their official website at axelar.network. You'll be able to ask their community about all the questions I didn't cover in this video, and I know there are many. In any case, I hope that this video made you want to know more. All I have left to say now is good luck and goodbye.